My name is Dia Shafira binti Karel Amri from Sekolah Kebangsaan Semenyih. Today, I'm going to do a storytelling entitled Mrs. Snooty Learned a Lesson. Let's begin. Mrs. Snooty was a very fine-looking man. He usually wore the most magnificent clothes in town. No one ever had clothes as smart or fashionable as his. His shoes were always clean and shining. His top hat was placed at quite the correct angle of his head. One thing that he could be lacking was his behavior. He was always very boastful and rude to people. He thought he was better than anyone else in the Hollow Hill. His neighbors found it so difficult to talk to him. It's because he made them feel quite bad about themselves. "I can't bear to speak to him," said Mrs. Ginger to Mrs. Hop when they bumped into each other at the baker shop. Mrs. Hop agreed with Mrs. Ginger. They talked too much about Mrs. Snooty. They almost forgot to buy their bread. The men of Hollow Hill were just as disgruntled with Mrs. Snooty. It's because he would not say hello nor smile to them when they passed him by the street. He refused to socialize with them either in parties or big town celebration. Therefore, he never had any real friends to talk to. It was really quite sad. The townfolk decided they were not going to bother about him anymore. But do you think Mrs. Snooty really cared? Absolutely not. He would just like to preen and strut around the town as usual. He was the richest and the best dressed man in town. Why did he need anyone to like him? One day, he strutted around the town as usual. He saw a magnificent gleaming carriage pulled by the most beautiful sleek horses. It drew up in the magnificent inn in town. He was really admired at the carriage. When the carriage stopped, out came the most wonderfully dressed man. Mrs. Snooty had never ever seen someone dressed smarter than him. The man was wearing satin striped waistcoat. His trousers were of expensive material too. His shoes were polished to a brilliant shine. He even made Mrs. Snooty feel quite shabby. Mrs. Snooty took a deep breath, cleared his throat. He stepped forward to greet the mysterious man. It was the first time he had an urge to greet someone. "Hello," Mrs. Snooty said to the man confidently. "You are new to our town, aren't you? Well, let me be the first person to greet you to Hollow Hill. I'm Mrs. Snooty." The man looked at him up and down. He did not like to be greeted by strangers. One of his coachmen whispered something into his ear. Mrs. Snooty did not hear what was said. The man looked at him and laughed. Then he walked away. Mrs. Snooty stared at the man, dropped jaw in astonishment. He was very taken aback. No one had ever made room to eat before. Mrs. Snooty sniffed. "Oh well, this man isn't worthy of my friendship," he thought. But deeply inside, he still wanted to know more about that grand man. Out of nowhere, Mr. Graves, the baker, came running down. He almost knocked Mrs. Snooty. He quickly ran toward the man. "Horace," called Mr. Chris, "I'm truly sorry that I'm late." The man turned around. He put a broad smile across his face. He surged forward and gave Mr. Chris a big bear hug. Mrs. Snooty stared at them. He was totally shocked. How could Mr. Chris, who he always thought the most unstylish man in Hollow Hill, could have a good friend as grand as this Horace person? Surely, if anyone deserved to be Horace's friend, it was him. He quickly went to the bakery. It was a place he knew people would gather to gossip. He really wanted to know more about Horace. Suddenly, he saw his neighbors, Mrs. Ginger and Mrs. Hop, in the queue. He thought they were talking about Horace, so he pretended to join the queue and stood closely to them. "Did you hear that Mr. Cribb's cousin, Horace, was in town?" asked Mrs. Hop. "Oh, yes," exclaimed Mrs. Ginger. She told Mrs. Hop that Horace had a plan to settle down in Hollow Hill. He was going to build a big, beautiful hotel in the town. Mrs. Snooty could not believe his ear. How could that be? He decided that he must get close to Mr. Cribbs so he can befriend Horace. Days after days, He tried his best to bump into Horace, but every time Horace stepped out, someone else from Hollow Hill accompanied him. He was really frustrated. Mrs. Tutti did not give up. He Mrs. Tutti did not give up. He kept on loitering around the town, hoping that he could meet Horace, but he still didn't have a chance to do so. It became obvious that Horace was trying hard to avoid him. He felt really hurt at insults. Am I also this rude to people? He asked himself. One day, he saw people pitching up tents in the town. He asked one of the workers about it. He was told that Horace was throwing a party. He invited all the important people except Mrs. Tutti. He was flabbergasted. He waited and waited, but no invitation card arrived. He felt more and more annoyed. No one likes me because I treat them badly, he said to himself. That night, he thought of going to bed early. Suddenly, he heard a knock on his door. When he opened it, it was Mr. Chris. He was holding an invitation card. Mrs. Tutti was shocked. He slowly took the card. Suddenly, he overcome with a mixture of guilt, relief, and joy. He asked for an apology to Mr. Chris for being rude to him after all the while. Mr. Chris gave him a big bear hug. To the surprise of everyone in Hollow Hill, Mrs. Tutti became friendly and polite after that day onward. He promised to turn over a new leaf. Everyone in Hollow Hill liked very much the new version of Mrs. Tutti very much. That's the end of my story. Thank you.